So I'm going to go very fast, and I'm not going to go into much detail because there isn't time. And getting me started is easy, getting me to stop is difficult. So I will start quickly by showing you a photograph. Oh, wait a minute, got to turn it on first, technology. Let's see if it's working. Okay, normally this is what I use to demonstrate and talk about the shroud, but because Pam brought her beautiful exhibit, and Pam just arrived. Hi, Pam. Pam brought her beautiful exhibit, which includes my photography, the life-size replica, and the ventral dorsal black and white views. One of, I think, 12 boards, isn't that correct? 12, Pam? Something like that. So obviously there was only room for a small amount of it here, but this is the important thing. So we're going to talk for a few minutes about the shroud so that I can basically give you a general indication of what's there. Because when you first look at the Shroud of Turin, it's pretty subtle. The images, you know, when you look at the shroud, you don't really even see the important part because all you see are these big scorchy lines that are running down the length of the cloth, and those are burns and scorches from a fire in 1532. What's really important is what's between them. And, you know, the shroud was just on public display in Turin just a month or two ago, and this explanation should help. The image is very subtle on the shroud. People look at it and they go, well, I don't even hardly see it. And Pam always points to this area, which is the face, but of course you can see that better on the black and white high contrast view. Sorry we're blocking it with this, but necessary. And so what's really critically important isn't all the obvious markings, but those that are much more subtle, which is the image of a man who has been crucified, crowned with a cap of thorns, speared in the side, whipped with a Roman flagrum, both, not just the back of his body, by the way, but the front. And this is another argument that I have in favor of its authenticity rather than being an artwork. Typically, artists who depict the flogging of Jesus in their artworks show his back ripped up. But guess what? If you're standing behind somebody and you hit him with a whip, if you take just a half step closer, those thongs are going to come around and they're going to hit the front of the body as well. And no artist that I'm aware of has ever depicted that. But if you look at this, you'll see that the scourge marks are on the front as well as the back of the body. Another indication that this isn't some artistic interpretation, but a more accurate, forensically accurate view of a man who's had these tortures applied. So quickly, let's see what the images are. This photo here is of an artwork that sort of explains how an image could appear on a sheet of cloth head to head, which is what we see on the shroud. This is a Della Rovere painting from, I don't remember, 16th century. But the cloth, the man would have been laid in the cloth with his feet at one end. It would have then been wrapped back up over his head and back to his feet. Now, some of my Christian friends say, wait a minute, in the New Testament it says there were linen strips, and they somehow think that that would imply he was wrapped like a mummy. And that's why they say, well, the shroud can't be real because in the Gospels it says linen strips. Well, if I wrap a body like this and I intend to move it at all, this cloth's just going to fall right off, so that they would bind the body into the shroud with linen strips. So what it says in the Gospels is correct, but has been misinterpreted by many into accept. By the way, by the first century, even the Egyptians had stopped wrapping mummies in strips. So in the first century, that wouldn't have even been an option. And I'm glad when I talk to you, I'm looking at the group, there are very few kids in the room, little kids, because a year or two ago I was lecturing to a group of 10-year-old kids, and I was talking about film, and finally a little boy put his hand up and said, excuse me, Mr. Schwortz, film, is that a USB device? That made me feel pretty old. Anyway, Secundo Pia was given the privilege of making the first photograph, and because he made that photograph, because that could then be reproduced and published and distributed, for the first time in history, people outside of pretty much just northern Italy got to learn about the shroud. So we always look at his photograph as sort of the opening of the scientific era of the shroud. Now, of course, this is what he saw. It looked like this to him when he looked through the ground glass of the camera. But of course, there was no color film in 1898. He had to shoot on black and white film. And so this is what the film recorded. And when Secundo Pia looked at this, he realized something that no one had ever realized about the shroud image before. What's here is a negative. The lights and darks are reversed from what we're used to seeing. We're used to seeing light highlights, dark shadows. And yet that's the inverse of what's on the shroud. So when you photograph it onto negative film, which again inverts it, then you get this image, which suddenly takes on a much more realistic characteristic. And here, let's look at it this way. And I'm going to go through these pretty quick, but you can clearly see the face. You can see the two cheekbones, one more swollen than the other. You can see, and let's see, if I push the button, it'll help. You'll see bloodstains covering the head, not in a pretty crown the way artists have always depicted it, because no Roman soldier is going to weave a crown for this criminal you're about to execute. They're not going to make him look pretty. They smashed a thorn bush onto his head because they were trying to humiliate him and add to his suffering and torture. And so we have the scalp covered with wounds, which is probably much more accurate than the artworks we've seen with the pretty little circlet. We have this line here that we can see on this is simply a crease in the cloth. But when you convert it to black and white and increase the contrast, it just becomes a line. And some people have misinterpreted that as some part of the image, which of course it's not. It's just a physical aberration of the cloth, which they used to roll up on a dowel and keep in a casket, a wooden casket, for centuries. So that crease was pressed in very tight, and even when we photographed it in '78, we tried to smooth it out. It was impossible. Anyway, continuing on quickly, we have this spear wound, which I can point to here, and it might be difficult for you to see it on this side. Spear wound with a blood flow below it. And I'm going to point out on the other half of the shroud, the back or dorsal view, that blood flow went around to the small of the back because of gravity and pulled at the small of the back. And that's nothing that a medieval artist could have even conceived of, let alone incorporated into an artwork. Not even Leonardo da Vinci. And I bring that up because somebody from the UK in 1995 wrote a book claiming that Leonardo da Vinci made this photographically, which I thought was a joke until I found out there was really such a book that claimed that. And I had to point out to my friend who mentioned it to me that the shroud is being publicly displayed 100 years before the birth of Leonardo da Vinci. He was a good artist, but he wasn't that good. So anyway, continuing on, we have the spear wound. Again, everything in concordance with what it tells us in the New Testament was done to Jesus. We can see his arms crossed, and we can see bloodstains coming down the arms. Some people have claimed that they can detect two different positions in the blood flows. That's not my field of expertise. I'll mention that to you. You can do a little research and find out that that's what some people claim. Here we have the wrist wound, the blood stain at the back of the wrist. Now I say wrist, it's actually not the center of the palm the way artists typically depict it, but probably just about an inch below. Sorry for inches, I'm American, we don't know the metric system. About an inch below the center of the palm, so it's still the palm. So it's not wrong if somebody writes that it's in the palm of the hand, but it's just a little bit below, because if you do this, and probably the Roman soldiers who had to do the dirty work of nailing someone to a cross figured the easiest way to do it, so it was less, because it couldn't have been much fun for them either. If you do this, you've got a perfect little spot to put a nail, you drive it through, and it also goes through a part of the wrist that wouldn't break any bones, but would secure the hand to the cross so that a strong man couldn't tear himself loose. That was really the main reason for that. Holes here that predate the 1532 fire. We know that from the copies of the shroud that were made prior to them that show those L-shaped burn holes. So we don't know what exactly caused them. We just know they predate the big fire that caused all the big damage. We have scourge marks down to the calves. So he was literally beaten from his neck down to his ankles. And we have scourge marks to prove evidence of that. And we see, and we can see it really pretty clearly. I don't think my microphone cable is long enough to get there. You can see a bloody footprint and the back of a heel. And if you look here, you can see the footprint and the back of the heel, so the toes would be sort of pointing away from us on this foot. And I'm not sure how well you can see that from the back. This is more of a closer look at the scourge wounds, particularly on the back. So certainly that was where they were aiming for when they started to beat him, but obviously they literally beat him from head to toe. This is what a flagrum looks like, and here's a close-up of a few flagrum wounds from the shroud, and you can see that these dumbbell-shaped weights, one of which has been found in Herculaneum, by the way, so that we do know that this is a credible depiction of what would be on the end of a flagrum. Here we have some of these wounds in close-ups. You can see that they pretty much match the shape of what was found. Now, our team got started because of this device. Now, I used to say, oh, this looks like an old stereo tuner. But if you say that to a 10-year-old, you get a blank stare, because if it isn't an iPad, then they don't know what it is. But this is the device that sort of prompted our team to get started. And what we did was, they took a photograph of the shroud, and they put it in this device. You input it with a black and white video camera. And then there's a green screen display, and with all these knobs and dials, you can control, and it takes the luminance, or the lights and darks of the image, and it extends them vertically into three-dimensional space. And these are video clips made directly from... Who's beeping? Is that me? This is taken right off the screen of a VP8. You can, and it's coarse because the 8 stands for 8 bits, which means only an 8-bit grayscale, so it's a rather coarse image, not very refined. But when you turn up and down the gain, there comes a point, and we can see that a little better here, where you get the natural relief of a human form. Now, the misunderstanding from the skeptics on this is, well, any image will give you 3D. Yeah, that's true, because the VP8 will take any light or dark and stretch it vertically into space based on its density. Absolutely. But a normal photograph does not yield the natural relief of a human form, and yet the shroud did. So when they saw this, a couple of scientists said, let's put a team together, see if we can get permission, let's go to Italy, and let's see if we can figure out how this image was formed, because this characteristic is not typical of photography artworks, either one. This is not something we can easily accomplish using either of those techniques. So that's what was the catalyst for the team. Now, here's a normal photograph. They move. Just to show you, notice the little boy here. Notice his hair is going deep down into his head. See this? Notice his nose and his cheeks are flat. And let's face it, the nose protrudes further than the cheeks, but we're not seeing that here, although we did on the shroud image. Notice that his mouth is so distorted that he looks like a little monster out of a horror movie. And this other kid, I don't even know what to say about him, but... So you can see that we don't get the same natural relief in a normal photograph that we would with the shroud. But we can go into the darkroom, and thank God I can say darkroom, and you know what I'm talking about. I said that to 10-year-olds, and the kid said, yeah, well, my room's dark when my mom turns out the light when I go to bed. But in the darkroom, where we're no longer limited to an 8-bit grayscale, and we have a much more continuous tone kind of image, now look at the face. Notice the features. This is not manipulated in the computer. This is done in a darkroom. This information is actually encoded in the shroud. You can see the arms crossing the torso. You can see the fingers. You can see the knees all the way to the feet, the back of the head, the shoulders, the buttocks. And there is some flattening of the back of the shoulders and buttocks, indicating he was lying flat on his back when the image formed. And look at the calves. I mean, it's very clear, and much more so in this image than in the VP8. Now, our team decided to get together. The first thing they did, I had done a 7-month project for Los Alamos National Laboratories as a photographic consultant. The guy I worked with for 7 months, a few weeks later, he'd been there when they did the VP8, called me up and he said, Barrie, what do you know about the Shroud of Turin? And I kind of laughed and I said, but Don, I'm Jewish. And Don laughed and he said, so am I, remember? He was one of the other Jewish guys on our team. And he was an imaging scientist. He was the guy I did the atomic bomb stuff with for Los Alamos. And he asked me to join the team and I said no, because I felt uncomfortable. Well, I was a young guy and I was 31 or 32 years old. I didn't have the confidence that I have now, or the knowledge. So I said no, I didn't want to join the team, but ultimately the image properties sucked me in, and I did join the team. So we spent 17 months planning our experiments, packaged up our equipment, shipped 80 crates of equipment over to Turin, got on an airplane, went over there to examine the shroud. Now, backing up for a moment, this is the dry run. This is the first time our team met together as a full team. We worked in regional groups. There was a California group, a Colorado group, a New Mexico group, and a New England group where most of our medical guys came from. And so here we decided we would design and fabricate a special steel table so we could fasten the cloth to it by magnets so we wouldn't cause it any harm. And here we are just sort of testing out the equipment and tables at a dry run a month before we went to Italy. So we go to Italy. Here's the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. Adjoining that is the Guarini Chapel. Literally, you could walk through behind the main altar of the cathedral right into the chapel where the shroud was typically stored. And this square building behind it is the Royal Palace where we ultimately would examine the cloth. And because the shroud in 1978 was the 400th anniversary of it arriving in Turin in 1578, they put it on public display. And you can see there's quite a number of people there until you look down here at the far left. And if we look just a little closer, 100,000 people in a queue waiting as long as 10 hours to see this piece of cloth. I was baffled at the time. I couldn't figure out why anybody wanted to do that. The good news is, in more recent years, thanks to the invention of the internet, now you can go online when they have a public display, make your own reservations, and the queues are barely there. It's much more efficient and fast thanks to the internet. So, you see, there are some good things about the internet. Anyway, we get to Turin, and the public display is still going on. We arrive a week early to unpack our equipment and get everything ready in the Royal Palace where we were to examine the shroud. This is the way it looks in on display in the Royal Palace at the time. This is the chapel behind it where the shroud was typically stored in this, behind this grating in the altar of the chapel. And right out the back door of the Guarini Chapel, you walk right into the Royal Palace. This is the casket, the wooden box that it was kept in, rolled up on a dowel, wrapped in red silk, and then in asbestos. Not a very good thing, but that's what they used to do. In 1997, they restored the dome of the Guarini Chapel. It had been falling down, pieces were falling, and somebody was going to get killed. They remodeled it. They moved the shroud out into the cathedral. As the shroud was out in the cathedral, they finished the dome. Everything was fine. And in 1997, an arsonist goes in, sets a fire, and completely destroys the Guarini Chapel, damages the cathedral and the Royal Palace. The shroud is rescued. You can go online on YouTube or on shroud.com. You can find it, the 1997 fire, and watch the video of the fireman who nobody told the fireman that a 9-pound hammer could not break bulletproof glass. So he grabbed the 9-pound hammer, went in, broke the bulletproof glass, and rescued the shroud. You know? And somebody asked him, how did you do that? He said, God helped. Couldn't argue with him on that one. After that, they realized maybe a wooden box isn't the best place to keep this relic. So they created a new reliquary. It's a big box. The shroud isn't rolled. It's kept flat. It's in a nitrogen argon atmosphere, temperature and humidity controlled, fireproof. It's a steel cabinet, thick glass, but kept flat. So the stresses on rolling and unrolling it certainly aren't good for it. This is what you would see in the cathedral today. You cannot see the shroud, but you can go in and you can see the reliquary itself. So now we're in Turin. We arrive, and the very first good news we're given is all your equipment has been seized by Italian customs, and they refused to release it because we had an X-ray machine. And the X-ray machine on the outside of the crate had a radiation sticker. Apparently put the fear of God into the Italian customs officials. They wouldn't release it. There was an Italian priest who lived in America, born in Turin, been an altar boy at the cathedral in 1931 when the shroud had been last shown, Father Peter Rinaldi. Father Peter, since he was born there, was our liaison with the Turin authorities and the king. He decided, I will go to the customs and I'll get the equipment out. And Father Peter was kind of a big guy with a pretty booming voice. And he was a priest, of course. Father Peter goes down to the customs office. He says, who's the man in charge? And the guy comes out. First thing Father says is, what is your name? Now the guy's a little suspect, a little nervous. He goes, well, why do you want my name, Father? And Father Peter says, because there's about to be an international incident, and I'd like to give you personal credit for it. And then he slipped him 100,000 lira. Now, it sounds like a lot of money. It was $80. That's why the Italians were so happy to go to the euro. It took so many lira to make a dollar. Anyway, Father Peter gets the equipment released, and he immediately, I'm sorry, I forgot about these. I'm jumping ahead. There's me next to Pia's camera, and I'll finish this last part of the story in a minute. I used to say, look, modern technology and next to this old tech. No, both obsolete, both use film. Old news. Now, they let us into the palace even though we didn't have our equipment. And since I'm from Pittsburgh and not a place that has too many palaces, I went around making some photos. This is the fresco in what we called the equipment maintenance room, which had actually been a bedroom for visiting royalty when the palace was still a palace. It was a museum by the time we got there. This is the fresco in the room in which we examined the shroud. Now, you remember that fire I told you about? I made these just for myself, just because I thought it was cool, and look how beautiful this is. But in 1998, a year after the fire, when the shroud had been rescued, and the fire and smoke and water damage to the palace where we examined the cloth had caused great damage to these, mostly smoke and water damage, I was given the honor, the opportunity and the honor to present to the Archbishop these photographs, which they could then use to help restore the frescoes back to the... Isn't that the way God works, though? I made this for myself. There was no purpose in these other than my own edification, and yet 20 years later they become important in the help of restoring that part of the palace that was damaged. And so this is in the courtyard of the royal palace, and I'm making this photo and I'm thinking any moment the guy's going to pull the lever and dump our instruments on the ground. Somebody actually ran up to him and said, "Don't dump the equipment." And he looked at him and said, "Of course not. You guys unpack it." So we unpacked it and we moved our equipment in. I'm going to go as fast as I can through these because we had to get our gear. Now, we'd gotten there a week early. The plan was to get all the equipment ready, so when they brought the shroud, everything was set up. And now we lost 5 days, actually 5.5. So that 1.5 days after we got our equipment, we worked around the clock to get the equipment set up and ready so that when they brought us the shroud, we would be prepared. Problem was, ever been to Italy, anybody? Well, you know how things run in Italy. A little late. All right, a lot late sometimes, let's be honest. So imagine our surprise when the equipment, somebody yells, "Here comes the shroud," and they bring it down the hallway an hour and a half ahead of schedule. In the meantime, this is that equipment maintenance room again, and I just want to point out this water hose. We had one instrument that required water cooling. This was pre-solid state electronics, so heat temperature was an issue. Well, I'm looking from the hallway into this room, and to my left is a long hall that goes way down. At the far end is the only operating bathroom in the royal palace, or at least in that half where we were permitted. So we had to buy a bunch of garden hoses, string them from the bathroom all the way up the hall, through the equipment maintenance room, through this doorway here to the right, into the room where we examined the shroud, and there you can see the hoses coming right in there at the bottom. So not exactly the laboratory setting you might have expected. So anyway, we also had to cover all the windows because we were doing thermal or infrared imaging. Too bad the infrared sensors in 1978 weren't as good as we have today. You realize that there's now an app for your phone that's a thermal imaging camera? I just saw it advertised on BBC last night. This is the camera rail system. They're measuring the distance, and we sandbag this rail in place. Because look at the size of this. You can't photograph the whole thing. The room wasn't deep enough for me to get back far enough, and then the image wouldn't be as good. So I photographed half at a time, but that rail was, once it was measured and put in place, I could do one half of the photograph here, slide the camera along the rail, and do the second half. 20 years later, when I had the images scanned and digitized so that I could put them together in Photoshop, when I put them together, it was a perfect match, because these men in that 17-month planning session designed and fabricated this camera support system, which allowed for that level of accuracy. So here it is. Now they're bringing the shroud down the hallway an hour and a half ahead of schedule. Here we are. They're already unraveling the shroud. That steel table we brought with us was made of steel, not stainless, because apparently there's some chemical composition in stainless that might be harmful to the cloth. So they made it plain steel, but then they realized plain steel can corrode, and sure enough, we got it unpacked, and there was a white powdery corrosion on the surface of all the steel panels. And the reason they're removable panels was we were going to do x-rays as well. So here we are now. Notice that's gold foil. Gold foil mylar, the same material used in cargo bay of the space shuttle and in satellites, because we had 2 NASA team members from the Jet Propulsion Lab. And when I'm in America, I always point out, because this is very expensive stuff, I always point out your tax dollars at work, but not yours, only the Americans. So here we are, there's unwrapping the shroud. Look, we're still not even finished covering those panels, and the shroud's already in the room. They brought it early. This is the cloth upon, the white wooden board upon which the shroud had been fastened for public display. I'm going to go through this quick. Anybody want to guess? Now, some of you have already heard me say this. You know how they fastened the Shroud of Turin to this piece of white painted wood to put it on public display? Now, I understand that in the UK, they don't call them thumbtacks. I'm not sure, does anyone know what the equivalent would be? It's a little flat tack with a pin sticking out the back.
Drawing pins.
Drawing pins, okay. So you know that they used about 100 of them to fasten this piece of cloth. So it's like they crucified the shroud 100 times. And of course, every time they pulled one out, little circle of rust with a rusty hole in the middle. We've all seen that, because they're not made out of stainless steel, they're made out of cheap metal. And imagine, we build a table, design and fabricate a steel table that articulates and does all this other stuff, removable panels, and they nail it to a piece of wood. We're a little shocked at that. I'm going to just whip through a bunch of pictures real quick. You're seeing that we're moving the cloth on to our table. Those white things around the periphery, those are the magnets. They're white because they're coated in Teflon. We did not want to let one particle of metal from the magnet even get on the cloth. So every magnet was coated with Teflon. This gentleman was given the opportunity to go first. He bought the cheapest dime store sticky tape he could find, and he starts sticking it down with his thumb all over the shroud. Every place he put his sticky tape, he left gum on the surface of the cloth that 20 years later had collected dust and dirt and were little dirty squares, and they had to be removed, cleaned. Look at the pressure he's putting on. Again, we were appalled. We also had sticky tape. We went to 3M, the real Scotch tape people. Not only did they make us tape that would not leave any residue on the shroud, they also tweaked the optical characteristics of the mylar base of the tape so we could do specific kinds of photomicroscopy right on the tapes. A little different than what Max was doing. And then Max goes over to the face, and he's about to stick the tape on the face, and one of our team members, John Jackson, runs over, grabs him, and literally, physically drags him away from the table. And if it looks like they're about to hit each other, they were. And the man in the middle is acting as the referee. That's Professor Ganella, who is the Archbishop's scientific advisor. See, now this isn't what you expect in a scientific examination. Professor Rigi goes next. He's an Italian. He decides to separate the shroud from the backing cloth that was sewn on after the fire to give it more stability, and insert a camera and a vacuum between the two. Brilliant idea. He was given 2 weeks, no budget. Think of something, because you have to go before the Americans. And that prompted me to make this photo, which you may have seen. It's probably the most well-known of the photos I made in '78. It is the first moment where we saw the backside of the shroud in 450 years. I'm not sure what the sister was thinking, but I don't think she was thrilled. Those are her hands, and she's removing a sample. And this is what Bologna got. Okay, this is the Italian researcher. Now, I'm sorry, because time is up. I'm going to just kind of go through this. I want to show you this is very important, and then I'm probably going to stop after this. Professor Rigi understood that if he wanted to photograph the back of the shroud, how are you going to know exactly where you're looking? So he had a 10 centimeter grid of string made, because his camera had a 10 centimeter diameter angle of view. It could see a circle 10 centimeters. So he puts it on the cloth, he centers the camera's focusing light underneath, and now he knows precisely what he's looking at the backside of. Think how brilliant and simple that is. Good scientist. We saw this, and what did we learn from this at that moment? We learned that the blood had soaked into the cloth, and when you transmit light through it, it's more dense there. Now think about this. If somebody had applied some form of paint or pigment, it too would have probably soaked in. It has to be applied generally with some kind of a liquid or viscous liquid. If it soaked in, if we photographed the whole shroud with transmitted light, we should then be able to see the paint if it's there. So I did. And look, bloodstains, scorches, bloodstains, water stains, burns, holes, patches. No image, because the image is only a few microns on the top surface of the fibers. It didn't penetrate into the cloth. It's not a painting. Sorry, Hugh. And here's the reference. So you can see where the image is. Now, I can go on for an hour. My normal talk is an hour and a half plus questions, but we don't have the luxury of that time at this moment, and I apologize for that. But I have to tell you that I'm pretty excited about the idea of going into the big tent and addressing the large group. And so what I want to do is I'm going to come to the end, but I'm going to just tell you something. When I started this, I didn't want to do this. I was uncomfortable doing this. But in the end, after 20 years, I kept thinking, why am I part of this? Why was I? See, I was thinking about myself. But after a while, it occurred to me that I wasn't in that room for me. I was in that room for you. To be the eyes for those who could not be there. I was given a great privilege, which brought with it an obligation. And that is to take what I accumulated and bring it together and bring it to you, to whom this truly does matter. So I'm sorry to stop in the middle, but my time is up. So I want to say thank you for your attention. It's a bit warm, I understand. And we'll have a few minutes for some questions. And so thank you very much for this. And now I'm ready to take some questions.
Start from the ladies' side.
Start with the ladies. Ladies first. Any ladies have a question? There's a question.
So the VP8 analyzer, you said was 8 bits. Is there more advanced technology now that
Good question. Good question. The VP8 image analyzer, which some people believed was a NASA instrument, which it isn't, is a better technology? Yes, there was even better technology then. This happened to be a dedicated instrument that could take image density and convert it into vertical relief, and so it was handy to use, and they happened to have one at Sandia Laboratories for analyzing X-rays. But even then, NASA had higher-end technology that could have been applied, but wasn't. And of course today, heck, most people's iPhones have better technology than this now. So, but that's an excellent question. Yeah, the technology we used 38 years ago, and which is why those of us who've been involved in this study all these years wish that we could now apply 21st century technology. You know, we could do chemical analysis just by pointing a camera at this now. Yes?
just a follow-up to that? Is there a reason why that's not possible? I mean, is there some project in the works to get better technology?
Oh, you mean at the time why we went with the VP8?
No, I mean like now.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, the owners have to permit it, and when we did this was not authorized by the church. People wonder why a Jewish guy like me is able to make these and distribute them, which I do, because I was authorized by the owner of the shroud, King Umberto II, the last king of Italy. He and his family owned it for 600 plus years, and he's the one who authorized it. The church, I'm not even sure the church is thrilled that I'm doing this. They weren't thrilled that our team came over to do it. But the king gave permission, and they were not the owners, they were the custodians, so they had to go along with what the king said. Mel Brooks once said, "It's good to be the king." I agree. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
The sellotape and the drawing pins,
Yes.
the crucifixion of the shroud, have they recovered from it?
Has the shroud recovered from what they did?
Yes.
Okay, you mean from the, yes, they cleaned that all off.
cleaned that off.
Yeah, about 20 years later they cleaned it all off, so that would be what, about 18 years ago. So it was removed. Yes, sir.
What about
Okay, won't go that far.
okay? What about this carbon dating of the cloth? I would like to know if it's
What about the carbon dating of the cloth? Now that in itself is normally a 30-minute lecture. Now how can I sum that up in 1 minute or less? Let me do this. Let me say that if you look up here, I'll point to it. Wish I had a little pointer. Can you see this corner? I know everybody probably can't. Well, you know what? Afterwards, come up and look. Up in this corner, you'll see a patch. Just below the patch, there's a seam. And just below the seam is a darker area that gradually gets lighter. And the area is only a couple of, maybe a centimeter or so. That's the piece they cut out. Cut it in half, put a half aside, took the other half, divided it in thirds, gave it to 3 radiocarbon dating labs, and the headlines after they finished was "The Shroud is a Fake." which isn't exactly a scientific statement. As a matter of fact, they did it with a photograph with the two dates, 12, whatever it is, 1265 to 13, whatever it is, I'm sorry, I don't remember, with an exclamation point after it, apparently a new form of scientific notation. It seemed like they were gloating over the fact they got a medieval date for it. I'll let you see the photo at some point. You can make up your own mind. Go to shroud.com. But basically, it took another 12 years for researchers to determine that there had been manipulation in that area, that the reason it's darker is it had been dyed, and they were able to identify the dye and the base the dye had been put in. It was rose madder dye from the madder root plant in a gum arabic base, which would allow them to apply it, because if you reweave something with new material, it's going to be lighter, so you have to dye it to match the rest. But over the years, that area darkened differently than the rest of the cloth. So there's a chemical difference in the material in that area that carbon dated from all the rest of this cloth. And consequently, after 12 years, evidence was published in several peer-reviewed, high-end peer-reviewed scientific journals indicating that there had been some manipulation, perhaps reweaving, and that it was chemically different there, and that the area tested, which was only a very small part, was not representative of the age of the main body of the shroud cloth. All those papers are available on shroud.com. I'm sorry to keep it, that's as short as I could make it. Okay. One more question. Any ladies? Yes, let's get a lady. There's a lady there.
What's your opinion about the image of the image on the sudarium provided compared to the Turin Shroud?
The question is, what's my opinion of the image on of what's on? There's not an image on the sudarium of Oviedo, which is in Spain, compared to the shroud. There is a cloth, and remember what it says in the New Testament, that there was a second cloth folded and separate from the other. Why was it in the tomb? Because it's a Jewish burial and has blood and fluids from the nose and mouth, pleural fluids and blood, and Jewish law requires to be buried with the body. They have that cloth in Oviedo, Spain. The bloodstains, some of the bloodstains line up with the bloodstains on the back of the man's head of the shroud. It's quite likely that that cloth was the second cloth mentioned in the Gospels, and it's dated back to the 7th century. So if there's a relationship between these two cloths, and this one's from the 7th century, and these two were ultimately together, then that's another reason why, that kind of goes against the radiocarbon dating. So I think the sudarium is most likely authentic. I said most likely because, again, no way to ever prove it to a scientific certainty. But, in a courtroom, they're not worried about that. They're worried about the total amount of evidence. There isn't one thing, but 1,000 things that finally convinced me. Folks, thank you so much. I'm going to be around tomorrow. There might be some opportunity if you come back for some questions or more discussion. I'd be happy to do it. Yeah. Thank you very much.
So Barrie will be here later today and tomorrow, so I'll get the whisk him away to the main tent now very quickly, but we can